4 jurors set up in their hotel room for the night gather around a circular table. Around the edges of the table, they've carefully placed scraps of paper, each one labeled with a letter from the alphabet. A glass sits upturned, its rim pressed firmly against the wood. Alcohol pulses through their veins with a syrupy encouragement to continue their task at hand. The lights are turned low and the stage is set. Each of the 4 jurors places a finger on the glass, and together they call upon the spirits of the victims they seek justice for. Gradually, the cup begins to shift, heading from letter to letter. The killer's name, damning him and sealing his fate, and then the final 6 letters. D-O-N-E-I-T. Stephen Young done it. With the victims' voices having been heard through their makeshift Ouija board, the jurors seal Young's fate and declare him guilty the next day. Stephen Young was an English insurance broker who was accused and arrested for the double murder of Harry and Nicola Fuller in 1994. His trial was hard, lasting 5 weeks, with brutal evidence that put the jury under a lot of stress. At the end of those 5 weeks, the jurors presented their guilty verdict, which was accepted at first, at least until one of the jurors fessed up to a solicitor that they and the others had used a Ouija board to contact one of the victims, who allegedly told them Stephen Young done it. This obviously sent the case straight back into a retrial, with the previous conviction being thrown out. This is probably one of the more egregious reasons a group of people have tried to use a Ouija board, but it helps to demonstrate the popularity of the Ouija board and just how easy they are to make. I am Olympia Stoker, your friendly local vampiric moss scholar, and today I'm making my own Ouija board. I wish it had been as easy as scribbling on scraps of paper and slapping a cup in the middle of a table, but no, I decided that I needed to cross-stitch one. The pattern looked simple when I picked it out, but no, it took me 40 hours. I know this because I was counting the entire time. I can't even use my Ouija board because I don't have a planchette. Can I cross-stitch a planchette? I should look into that. Fun fact, the Ouija board was actually preceded by the planchette. But before we get into the history of Ouija and its precursors, we need to establish the foundation for why it was so quickly adopted. As a baseline, people already had a proclivity and a desire to talk to the dead. This was something that was already somewhat mainstream in the United States during the 1800s and 1900s. This desire to commune with the dead in your own home was absolutely a product of the Spiritualism movement, and it was possibly born from some carryover from Victorian England's fascination with all things Egyptian. But let's focus specifically on Spiritualism. Spiritualism loosely began in the 1840s and carried through to the 1900s. It can largely be hailed as a religious movement where the primary goal was to establish contact with the dead. There are some people who believed that spiritualism was an affront to Christianity and God, but there were other people who were Christian, like Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock Holmes books, who firmly believed that spiritualism was perfectly compatible with Christian beliefs. Spiritualism already had a decent amount of traction as it spread, but after the American Civil War, it exploded in popularity. The American Civil War, lasting from 1861 to 1865, contains what has been established as the single bloodiest day in U.S. history, with the Battle of Antietam, also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg. Around 23,000 soldiers were killed, went missing, or were injured, which left so many families across the North and the South devastated and without proper closure. Spiritualism provided a way for people to start finding that closure by allowing them the opportunity and the belief that they were talking to their deceased or missing loved one. And the same pattern followed during and after the World Wars, especially in the Roaring Twenties. In fact, Ouija was so normalized in the public mainstream at that point that on the cover of the May 1920 edition of the Saturday Post, a man and a woman are depicted playing with a Ouija board. Of course, it was also the center of titillating stories, from people who were trying to solve murders with Ouija, to people befriending and giving their wills, to the spirits they met through their talking boards, to people who literally committed murder because their Ouija board apparently told them to. In fact, that last little bit is probably the only time Ouija boards were hailed as explicitly malicious by the public before a specific movie and book came out, but we'll cover those later on. As mentioned earlier, planchettes were actually one of the Ouija board's precursors. They weren't invented with the talking board. Shocking, I know. Before we had the Ouija board, we had mediums who would hold seances. We had tarot and oracle decks, and we had something you called automatic writing. Automatic writing, known as psychography, is the belief that you are not consciously writing. You are merely acting as a conduit for something or someone to write through. And then someone would interpret all of those scribbles, because unless your ghost is very skilled, they're going to have horrible handwriting. Have you ever tried to write with someone else's hand? It's not easy, even if they let you have complete control of how their hand moves. It's even worse because you're not even holding their hands in some cases. The planchette used to just be this thing with a hole that you stuck your pencil through, and then the ghost would wiggle your hand around to write something that was hopefully legible. Even better is that if your planchette was big enough, multiple people could join in on trying to practice automatic writing, which means more hands for the ghost to move around and more people who could be lying through their teeth about not moving the planchette to try and write something out. We all know you think you're funny, Steven, but you're not. We know you moved the planchette yourself and lied about it. You're not that slick, bro. And this is part of the reason people were growing sick of the planchette and the scribbling. They needed change, innovation, something brilliant and new, and thus came talking boards. Unlike what I'm stitching, most of your basic talking boards at the beginning were, well, basic. They didn't have fancy borders and decor adorning all sides. Like the earlier mentioned jurors, people could always make their own. They scribbled out letters and numbers, a simple yes and no, and a way to bid the spirit farewell so they wouldn't remain lingering. Manners are important after all, especially if you don't want your guests to overstay their welcome, as is such a pervasive fear regarding Ouija nowadays. Point is, it was a thing you could make at home pretty easily, and it was a way that the average person could talk to the dead without a medium to hold a seance. Naturally, the planchette evolved to fit the talking board, and it became something you slid around the board with a little window in the middle, just big enough to show a letter or indicate a yes or no answer. Talking boards are verifiably less effort for a ghost, given that they're not trying to write via proxy, but they also require much quicker thinking and effort from a con man. A con man would need to be literate, or at least know whether or not the spirit of the dead would be literate enough to spell properly, and they would absolutely have to BS their way through the entire session. Sure, they could only use yes or no answers, but that's not going to fly with every question. Not unless your ghost is just stupid or intentionally obtuse. In a way, that made talking boards so much more reassuring to people who wanted to talk to the dead. For clarification, the Ouija is a talking board, but not all talking boards are Ouija, even though it's basically become the standard to call talking boards Ouija. In fact, the beginning of the Ouija board can be somewhat pinpointed to when its patent was issued on February 10th, 1891, given to one Elijah J. Bond. According to an interview done by Time magazine of Robert Murch, one of the leading authorities on Ouija, having researched it for over 2 decades, the origins of Ouija began in 1890, before the patent was even officially issued. Elijah Bond, a lawyer, met up with Charles Kennard. Together they held a seance with Bond's sister-in-law, Helen Peters, who Bond termed as a strong medium. The three of them asked the Ouija board what it wanted to be called, and utilizing the planchette, it spelled out O-U-I-J-A, Ouija, which the board told them meant good luck. This is probably why if you Google Egyptian luck boards, you're going to see the Ouija board. After Bond and Kennard patented the Ouija board, William Fuld bought access to it a little later in 1893, after it had already made Kennard and Bond a lot of money. Fuld kept producing Ouija, even battling his own brother in court for the right to be its sole producer, which was a battle he won, by the way. This next section got lost. I don't know how. Probably the Hasbro demons who are mad I'm making this video, but, you know, that's their issues, not mine. Essentially, after William Fuld fought his brother in court like a greedy capitalist, and won the right to be the sole producer for Ouija, he kept hold of the patent until his family eventually sold it in 1966, which is well after he died. They sold it to the Parker brothers, who also kept hold of the patent and the production of Ouija boards, and I have this neat little advertisement I'll throw up on screen that I found. But basically, Hasbro bought Parker Brothers in 1991, and so now Hasbro owns the Ouija board, which is why the Hasbro demons are after me. Back to our regularly scheduled content. Regularly words. However, before we get started on the contemporary history of Ouija, especially in popular culture, we should take a look at someone who also shot Ouija into the limelight, Pearl Curran. Pearl Curran's story is possibly one of the most infamous, with her Ouija board, and the supposed spirit of a 17th century woman named Patience Worth right at the center of it. Pearl Curran was an early 20th century housewife who really didn't have a very strong education. She wasn't a great student, but her childhood friends apparently recalled her having a pretty good memory, with an affinity for lively descriptions in her writing. At 13 years old, she had a quote-unquote nervous collapse and was withdrawn from school. In her adult life, she was described as being plagued by phantom ailments and generally just not being all that mentally sound. After her father died, Pearl finally tried out a Ouija board with what could be described as her best friend, Emily Grant Hutchings. For a while, Pearl dismissed her attempts with the Ouija as entirely ridiculous, calling it silly chatter. However, she kept playing around with the board, and in 1913, Pearl made her first contact with Patience Worth. Eventually, Pearl came to the conclusion that she, rather than Emily, was the one who was getting into constant contact with the spirit. Her medium, if you will. Sorry, Emily, but you suck, and Patience likes Pearl better, so she's going to make sure Pearl gets all of the fame and the glory. Never mind the fact that whenever anyone talks about Pearl, the articles always have Patience's name in the titles instead. Even Wikipedia. If you Google Pearl's name, guess what pops up? Patience this, Patience that. Everybody overlooks the medium, and everybody also overlooks the medium's bestie, who's the entire reason that Patience even gotta be in the spotlight, but whatever. It's fine. It's fine. I feel bad for you, Emily. You could have been the medium. Unfortunately, Pearl saw an opportunity and she took it. Anyway, Emily dips out of the story at this point for the most part, which leaves Patience and Pearl in the limelight. After Patience and Pearl start gossiping through the Ouija board together, leaving Emily out of their conversations entirely, Pearl began to start reciting Patience's works. Around 1915-ish, 1916-ish, Patience and Pearl started getting a lot more attention, and Patience's work started to be published. And with that came the media, who took a massive interest in this woman who was supposedly channeling the spirit of a 17th century spirit just to publish that spirit's work. Of course, Pearl was understandably accused of being a fraud, utilizing the fascination with Ouija and the occult for her own gain and to publish her own work. Honestly, if that's true, then Pearl was a marketing genius. Such a great strategy to keep people interested in you. Every good celebrity needs a thing that makes them distinct, and channeling the spirit of a dead woman? That's one of the most unique things you could probably do at the time. Of course, this doesn't mean it was or wasn't real. We don't know. Pearl never let herself be studied by psychologists and neuroscientists, and honestly, that one's understandable, girly pop. I wouldn't want early 20th century doctors anywhere near my head either. She fell off the radar a bit more after she had 2 children, one adopted and one biological, the latter of which was born 6 months after her husband died. To try and supplement her income to care for her children, Pearl often did public demonstrations of her using a Ouija board and reaching out to patients. She never lost her celebrity status entirely, but she definitely wasn't at the center of international news anymore. Either way, no matter where she moved, apparently, Pearl continued to receive messages from patients right up until she died at the age of 54 in 1937. Of course, fascination with the Ouija board and talking with the dead didn't die with Pearl, and the public fascination with the talking board in question has only continued on to the modern day. But you might have noticed one key difference between the historical view of Ouija and the modern view of Ouija. While people might have been skeptical of Ouija boards, they were not, historically speaking, intrinsically tied with the concept of evil. People generally found them harmless enough, even if they thought them to be some kind of affront to God and Christianity. However, we can probably pinpoint one of the exact moments when public opinion began to turn on the Ouija board. Rather than being a way for people to communicate with their dead relatives or 17th century authors with a minimal amount of risk, Ouija became this evil gateway to demons and darkness beyond compare. And this is all courtesy of The Exorcist. Mostly. Right up until The Exorcist came out in 1973, Ouija was well known, but it wasn't really regarded as this threatening thing. You know, if we ignore all the cases where murderers claim that their Ouija boards inspired them or told them to do it. And I mean, historically, most people ignored that fact, so I'm going to do it too. The Exorcist, written by William Peter Blatty, is a horror novel that was originally released in 1971. Not 2 years later, in 1973, it received a movie adaptation that is still widely regarded as one of the most unsettling and terrifying movies to ever hit the market. If you don't know what the plot of The Exorcist is, I'm going to read a quick synopsis provided by Google. When young Regan starts acting odd, levitating, speaking in tongues, her worried mother seeks medical help only to hit a dead end. A local priest, however, thinks the girl may be seized by the devil. The priest makes a request to perform an exorcism, and the church sends in an expert to help with the job. Doesn't sound particularly exciting or terrifying, but well, it is. It really is terrifying. Shockingly, if you didn't know, Blatty had no intent for The Exorcist to actually be a horror book when he wrote it. It was just supposed to be a mystery novel, yet somewhere along the line it ended up being horror, and I guess he just decided not to question it. This man didn't even set out to leave lasting scars upon the collective subconscious, and yet, here we are. That takes a special kind of skill that very few people actually have. That said, I'm not here to give you a review of The Exorcist and tell you whether or not it's deserving of its reputation. Although it is. It really is. What we're here to discuss is the utilization of the Ouija board within The Exorcist. While stories of the Ouija board being connected to evil or heinous acts were few and far between, The Exorcist decided to completely ignore its prior reputation and make it into this gateway to evil. Regan, our young victim, utilizes a Ouija board and makes contact with Captain Howdy, and she subsequently ends up getting possessed, like the most possessed that a person could possibly get. If there was a scale on how possessed someone could be, Regan has broken it. She has won the world speedrun record for 120% possession. And that scared the shit out of people. And that's where it all started to go downhill for the Ouija board. There are claims that sales of the Ouija board plummeted after The Exorcist was released, although I personally struggled to find any specific numbers regarding that. But from that point on, Ouija boards were inextricably linked with dark and evil forces in the eye of the general public. People became a lot more wary of them to the point where some people today still consider even owning one to be a bad omen. They showed up way more in horror movies, with one, Ouija from 2014, being specifically about the use of a Ouija board. Of course, with the intense fear of the Ouija board came Gothic subcultures very quickly adopting it. It was a symbol of perverse evilness, macabre in its own right, and it became more popular within the witchcraft and Wiccan communities, utilized in divination practices. For as many people as there are who are scared of the Ouija board, there are just as many who love and respect it. If you look on Reddit, the world's most reliable place on the internet, it's not, but we can pretend it is, you can pretty easily find stories of people using Ouija boards. You'll have quite a few people who say absolutely nothing happened. Some people will claim that something happened, even if they're not quite sure what, and others will write out that they had the most terrifying experience in their life and they've subsequently sworn off anything to do with the paranormal ever since. And I mean, it's perfectly feasible that these stories were made to garner fake internet links, and it's perfectly feasible that some might have actually happened. I don't want to blatantly claim that there's nothing to Ouija, or that it is some definitive gateway to the other world, because nobody's going to know. Believers will believe, and skeptics won't. What we do know, however, is that Ouija has absolutely enraptured people for dozens of decades, and that it's become a really iconic occult item. When people think about connecting to the paranormal, Ouija is right up there alongside seances. Capitalism has always had its grimy hands strangling the concept of Ouija half to death, but the merchandising of its image has never been stronger. Hasbro may be the only official production crew for the Ouija board, but there are plenty of talking boards that still exist and don't fall under Hasbro's purview. Some are jokes like the Ouija board, while others are blatant pieces of fan merchandise. The Beetlejuice Ouija board and the Exorcist Ouija board are officially produced by Hasbro, but you can find other pieces that are on Etsy. Hell, there's even a Holy Spirit board, where it's claimed that you can talk directly to Jesus. Many versions of the Ouija board exist, it's been made into jewelry, and if you've watched my excellent stitching, you might have seen my needle minder, which is a Ouija board. There's mouse pads, mints, enamel pins, custom Ouija boards, and custom planchettes that exist in a plethora on Etsy. There's probably a Ouija board kitchen sink somewhere. Yes, you can still try to use Ouija as a way to talk to the dead now, but it's definitely taken on a life of its own. The fascination with Ouija has extended beyond its utility to talk to spirits and into a simple adoration of the aesthetic. For some, they represent evilness and bad luck. You'll find yourself being warned to be careful that you don't understand the powers that be if you try to mess around with one. For others, they represent a cultural adoration and obsession with the macabre and paranormal. Whether you believe in Ouija or not, it's hard to deny that it leaves quite the aesthetic impact at least. Some boards are absolutely works of art that should be put on display. And the same goes for some carefully crafted planchettes. I, for one, made my own work of art by stitching my own Ouija board because I'm broke. I still don't have a planchette. I don't know how one would work on fabric, but maybe if I trap this entire stitch beneath glass, then it could be a fully functional Ouija board that will allow me to taunt the demons of the beyond, much to the pleasure of my family, I'm sure. I'm sure it won't upset them at all if I try to beat Reagan's possession speedrun. Or maybe I'll just hang it on my wall and not try to use it to pin all my problems on the demonic. Anyway, I am Olympia Stoker. I'm not possessed just yet, and I hope you enjoyed this brief history of the Ouija board. All of my sources are in my description, as well as related reading and extra socials. And with that, I leave you with this friendly reminder that the demons can't get you if you get them first.